The notorious kingpin Nathan Calloway received a phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning, the kind of hour when the world feels suspended between memory and regret. His former lover, Emily Carter, was in labor and in critical condition, and only he could save her. He had once abandoned her in the freezing rain of Pennsylvania, leaving her standing there soaked to the skin, heart shattered, without offering a single explanation. Yet fate refused to leave him in peace. Now it pulled him back to the place where he had buried every feeling he once had, Mercy General Hospital, where Emily was fighting for her life while carrying his child. Her heart was slowing, and the blood she needed was his own. Nathan, the man who once made the underworld of Philadelphia bow their heads, was about to learn a truth his lifetime of power had never taught him. Some battles are not meant to be fought with gunfire, but with love, with remorse, and with the weight of accountability. The rain no longer fell, it lashed like fury. Each drop struck the windows of the Ravenshade Hill estate like shards of glass, piercing through the manufactured silence. Beyond the glass, the city slept in darkness, unaware that within this quiet night, the coldest and most unfeeling man alive sat unmoving in a room washed in soft golden light. A glass of whiskey rested untouched in his hand, its flavor already faded. The antique clock ticked steadily. 2 o'clock exactly. A shrill sound erupted as the phone vibrated violently on the mahogany table. He glanced at the screen, not a subordinate, not an assistant, but an unfamiliar number. He nearly ignored it, until instinct whispered danger. The woman's voice on the line was weak, trembling, yet urgent. "Mr. Calloway, this is Mercy General. Your number is listed as the emergency contact for Miss Emily Carter." He froze. Her name struck his mind like a bullet shattering the glass he had placed around his emotions. Emily. It had been 1 year since he last heard anyone speak her name. 1 year since he drove her away in the rain, her heart breaking while his eyes remained dry and cold. She had begged him, sworn she had never betrayed him, but he refused to listen. And now his blood was her only hope. "She is in labor," the nurse continued, "but her condition is extremely critical. Her blood type is rare. The emergency system traced you as the only compatible match." Nathan's fingers tightened around the phone, his jaw locked. In that moment, there was no Mafia, no empire, no power, only a man hearing words that could change everything. He stood abruptly, the walls around him seeming to collapse. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the rain exploding against the glass. Emily's face appeared in those drops, her smile, her tears, the pain in her eyes when he left her behind. The nurse's voice pushed through the thunder. "If we do not act immediately, both she and the baby may not survive." He did not respond. He simply ended the call, the screen going dark. Silence swallowed him whole. The defenses he had built inside himself crumbled layer by layer. Nathan was not the type of man who lost control, but tonight every rule he had lived by fell apart. He lunged for his keys, his expression hollow. On the shelf, something caught his eye, an old photograph, the only one left of them. Emily was laughing in his shirt, the sunlight blazing across her hair like a warm flame. He had thought he threw that picture away. His heart tightened sharply. He grabbed his coat and tucked a gun into the waistband out of habit, the instinct of a man forged in danger. Yet this time he feared no enemy except the possibility of losing the only woman he ever loved. The rain struck his face like a reprimand as he opened the door. His driver rushed forward with an umbrella, but Nathan brushed him aside. He let himself be drenched, as though the sky itself were passing judgment. The car tore through the night, the city, blurred past in streaks of light reflected on rain-soaked pavement. His reflection in the window no longer looked like a kingpin, but a man racing against destiny. Emily's voice echoed in his mind, the last words she ever said to him. "One day, you will regret letting me go." Back then, he had laughed, assuming she was trying to manipulate his emotions. Tonight, those words were a curse returning to life. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, watching familiar streets slide by like memories rushing past too quickly to catch. Everything he had built was nothing but ash if she were to die. And then, beneath the rumble of thunder, he whispered to himself, no longer the powerful Mr. Calloway, but a man pleading in the dark. "Please, don't die still hating me. If you are still listening at this moment, perhaps your heart is trembling along with Nathan's as he races through that storm." Before we continue down this breathless path, take a moment to subscribe, to like, and to share this video with someone who might also need to be touched by a story as raw and emotional as this one. Tell us where you are listening from, the city or state you call home, so we know this story has reached you, whether you are anywhere across America or somewhere far beyond. Your presence is what keeps us telling stories that run deep and ring true. And now, let us return to the journey of Nathan Calloway, the man risking everything to reclaim the one thing he cannot afford to lose. The rain did not let up, as if the sky itself were furious on her behalf, each driving sheet of water lashing against the glass of the sleek black Cadillac that was hurtling down the highway. The streetlights threw pale yellow streaks into the car's interior, cold and uneven, like the scattered fragments of Nathan Calloway's memories tangled in his mind. He sat in the back seat, his coat still damp, his hair hanging over his forehead, one shoulder already chilled to the bone, where the wet had soaked through. The phone was still clutched in his hand, the screen dark but somehow still burning with the echo of the nurse's voice cutting through the storm in his memory. If there is no blood, both she and the baby may not survive. That sentence kept reverberating in his head, weaving itself together with Emily's voice from long ago. I just want you to believe me once. He had never done that, not even once. Nathan Calloway, the man the shadowy world of East Coast money and crime called the one who does not know how to love, now sat in the dark like any ordinary man, feeling fear for the first time. Not fear of guns, not fear of death, not fear of enemies. He was afraid of arriving too late. Beside him, a bottle of 32-year-old Glenfiddich sat open. It was the kind of whiskey he kept only for the day he signed a contract worth $100 million, or the night he crushed a long-standing enemy. Yet tonight the glass he had poured was still full, untouched. His throat was dry and raw, but he did not feel thirsty. His eyes were fixed on the curtain of rain beyond the windshield, not really seeing the road at all, only seeing her as she had stood there last year, on his doorstep, in a long coat soaked through. She had been trembling from the cold, one hand pressed over her belly as if to shield the fragile life just beginning to form inside her. I did not betray you. You know I am not that kind of person. That plea had rung out as clearly as church bells after a service, echoing with no one willing to listen. And he had stood on the threshold, staring at her without blinking, his face expressionless, his voice colder than the rain pounding on her shoulders. Leave. Do not ever come back. He had thought that was strength. He had believed the people who told him she had betrayed him, that the child was not his, that she was nothing more than a trap laid by his enemies to dig secrets out of him. And he believed it. He believed it so easily that he did not even ask for proof. Because he was afraid, not of the truth, but of feeling betrayed one more time. His past had already been dragged into darkness by another woman, and from that day on he had sworn that no one would ever step into his heart again. But Emily was not that woman. She was an elementary school teacher, the one who had taught him how to smile without having to be on guard, the one who folded his handkerchiefs for him every morning, who slipped little notes into the pocket of his suit jacket reminding him not to smoke. And he had thrown all of that away because of a rumor. Now, as night swallowed the city and the storm howled like something rising from the depths, he finally understood that what he had destroyed was not just a relationship. It was a woman who had trusted him with her whole heart. She had carried his child inside her, chosen to keep it even knowing she might be abandoned, even though she had nothing to hold on to except a wounded heart. Nathan's hand trembled for the first time in many years. It was not from the cold, but from guilt. He curled his fingers into a fist until the knuckles turned white, let his head rest against the back of the seat, and closed his eyes as if he wanted to lock himself inside his own darkness. But in that darkness her image rose again, Emily's face glowing in a bright spring morning, grinning at him over a pancake with its edges burned because she had been careless, her eyes scrunched up as he teased her. Happiness had once existed. He had simply failed to keep it, and now he had only a few dozen minutes, only one rain-drenched stretch of road, to try to repair what he had broken, if heaven allowed it. Outside, a jagged bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating his reflection in the window. It was no longer the face of a cold-blooded kingpin, but the face of a man crushed beneath the weight of his own past, a man bartering everything he had to cling to the one thing left in his heart. Emily. And the baby. If she did not survive, he knew he would never truly be himself again. Her name rang in his head like a gunshot in a sealed room, with no escape for the sound except to punch through every barrier in his chest. Emily. Just that single word was enough to fracture everything inside Nathan Calloway. He had once been the man who did not flinch when he signed off on the fate of a traitor, the man who did not blink as he watched an enemy collapse with pleading eyes. Yet tonight the very name he had tried so hard to forget made his hands shake without stopping. Every time the nurse repeated it on the phone, every time her voice said Emily Carter, he felt his heart tighten, as if wrapped in barbed wire. She was lying on an operating table, balanced on that thin line between life and death, alone, with no family, no comforting words, only wave after wave of searing labor pains and one name she was murmuring in her delirium, his. He had thought he had locked that door with her name on it. He had deleted every message, thrown away every keepsake, burned every picture, but memories do not burn. They live on inside you like an ember hidden in a dark cellar, waiting for the right moment to flare. And tonight, with a single phone call, that ember had become a firestorm, melting the ice he had believed to be unbreakable. Nathan opened his eyes and stared straight at the road ahead. Rain poured down the windshield, and the headlights swept through the darkness as if peeling back the curtain on his past. The car slid past blurred highway signs, and his heart hammered against his ribs, as though counting down to the moment when everything would change. Emily's last words to him rose up one after another. "One day you will regret letting me go." Back then he had scoffed, cold as stone, convinced she was only trying to soften him. But tonight those words were no longer a complaint. They were a prophecy. A fate he had finally reached and could no longer avoid. The rain seemed to grow heavier. Each drop struck the glass as if reminding him that time was not on his side. She was growing weaker. And the baby, he could not bear to finish that thought. He had once refused to believe the child was his, refused to believe the love she offered him was real, all because he was afraid that love was a snare, afraid that if he allowed his heart to soften, he would lose his power, that he would be wounded again the way his mother had been when his father abandoned her in the cruelest winter in Pittsburgh. The pain of a child left behind had never truly left him, and because of that, he had unconsciously repeated the same cruel cycle with Emily. He had become the very man he had sworn he would never resemble. A man who walked away from the woman carrying his own flesh and blood. The wail of an ambulance siren echoed somewhere ahead, its red lights flashing in reflections across the pools of water on the road. Nathan stared at that distant glow as if it were the place where the truth was waiting for him. Her name kept sounding in his mind, no longer like a gunshot now, but like a whispered plea. Each time it echoed, it cut into his pride, forcing him to accept that he no longer had the luxury of running from what he felt. Emily did not need a kingpin. She needed a man who knew how to keep his word, a man who stayed when the first drops of rain began to fall instead of slamming the door. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, and in his mind, she appeared exactly as he remembered her in their quietest moments, not begging, not sobbing, but lying in their bed with her hair tousled and her gaze gentle as she murmured, "Sometimes I wish you were not the man everyone is afraid of." Now he wished for only one thing, to be the man she needed most in this moment. And if she lived, he swore her name would never again thunder through him like a gunshot, but would become a prayer on his lips, every night, for the rest of his life. The black Cadillac continued cutting through the rain, as if slowing down for even a single heartbeat would allow something irreversible to happen. Inside the car, the silence felt suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic sweep of the wipers across the windshield, the relentless pounding of rain against the metal frame, and the uneven, unruly thudding of Nathan Calloway's heart. He sat upright, yet his right hand had already clenched into a fist on his thigh, his entire body drawn tight like a strained wire. Emily was lying somewhere out there in the storm, in pain and utterly alone, while he was trapped inside this metal box, racing against time and the consequences of his own foolish choices. Every time a streetlight passed and briefly illuminated his reflection in the window, he looked like a ghost. No longer the cold-blooded mastermind of underground dealings, but a man being suffocated by a past he could no longer outrun. On the front seat, his coat was still soaked through. The smell of damp leather, whiskey, and regret mingled into a heavy atmosphere that clung to him like a second skin. His memory, as it always did, began to betray him, dragging him back to days he had convinced himself he had forgotten. One autumn afternoon in the tiny kitchen where Emily once lived, when she had wandered in circles baking an apple pie and completely ignored the oven timer ticking away. Smoke had filled the room, the fire alarm shrieked, and she had laughed like a mischievous child, wiping her hands on a floral apron she used to joke she would only wear when she grew old. Nathan, the man who once used money to solve every problem, had stood there helplessly, baffled like a fool, not knowing what to do except wrap his arms around her from behind and whisper a sentence he never repeated again for an entire year afterward. "Do not ever leave me." Yet he had been the one who walked away. He was the one who pulled his hand back first, the one who slammed the door while she was still, standing there clutching her belly, pleading through tears, drenched in the early winter rain. He was the one who chose silence when she said, "If you do not believe me, then I have nothing left to hold on to." And he did not believe her, because of a tip whispered by an informant who later paid with his life for betraying him. Because of a rumor murmured at a high society party that Emily had once contacted a land broker who had been at odds with Nathan. That was all it took for his trust to collapse like a building bombed from within. He had never verified the truth, never asked her directly. He chose the easiest path for a man like him, punishing her with abandonment. The last time she appeared, it had been only to say a sentence that now stabbed into every fiber of his heart. "I can forgive you for everything except believing this child belongs to someone else." He had turned away then, without a word. She had walked off with a life inside her that had not yet taken its first breath, and Nathan never once looked back. That had been the first time he forced the person he loved most out of his life, and it might be the last. Because tonight every promise he made, every word he never spoke, every piece of unfinished love was lying on an operating table where a woman fought to keep alive the child he once refused to call his own. A bead of sweat slid down his temple despite the icy cold car. He bowed his head, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. If fate granted him even one more chance, he swore he would never repeat his mistake. Not once. Not with her. Not with his child. The car turned onto the highway exit, the sign showing Mercy General 8 miles ahead, though Nathan knew time was shorter than any number printed on a board. He lifted his gaze, eyes fixed on the storm ahead. Behind him were memories that refused to stop chasing him. In front of him was the fragile hope waiting beneath emergency room lights and the monitoring machines that could fall silent at any moment. He would not allow himself to be late. Not this time. Not when her name still echoed in his heart like an unfinished prayer. The rain fell as if it were a verdict from the heavens. Not merely water but icy lashes striking the road, the car, his thoughts, and every nerve in his body. The Cadillac had barely left the highway and begun the climb up the hilly road toward Mercy General when the sky seemed to erupt in fury. Winds howled, the trees on both sides of the road bending violently as though intent on tearing themselves out of the earth. The headlights cut into the dense sheets of rain, but only enough to reveal a few feet ahead. Beyond that lay a blackness without depth or end. The car skidded slightly as the tires hit a flooded patch, and Nathan clenched his teeth, his fingers locked so tightly around the wheel that the tendons strained. But he did not slow. He could not. Not when Emily's life and the life of their unborn child were hanging by a thread because he dared lose even a single moment. The GPS flickered in confusion as the storm scrambled its signal, and the robotic female voice repeating weather alerts only sharpened his impatience. His eyes stayed forward, but his heart lurched violently when a massive tree limb suddenly snapped and came crashing down across the road right in front of him. He jerked the wheel, the entire car lurching to one side, the back tires slipping off the pavement, the shriek of rubber slicing through the air. In that instant, everything slowed as if the world had been pushed underwater. He saw Emily lying on a hospital bed, her face pale, her thin arms wrapped protectively around her belly. He saw the look in her eyes the last time she turned away, saw the distant glow of a delivery room light flickering like a signal from the edge of hell. Then the car slid into the metal guardrail. The impact slammed his head lightly against the side window, not enough to draw blood. The headlights flickered. Nathan gasped for breath, hands still welded to the wheel as if letting go might shatter him completely. The sky kept roaring, the rain kept pounding, yet inside the car all sound seemed to drift away until only his own heartbeat remained, pounding like a drum summoning a lost soul. He pressed the brake, exhaled sharply, then pushed down on the accelerator. The engine growled. The car climbed over the broken branch and continued forward. Cold sweat clung to his skin, but his eyes never left the road. Nothing would stop him. Not the rain, not the wind, not the past. Nothing mattered except reaching her in time to tell her he had been wrong, that the baby was his, that he wanted the chance to begin again. The rain stabbed the windshield like falling blades, But now they no longer felt like punishment. They were a test, a question for him alone to answer. Did he have the courage to make this right? The lights of the hospital began to glimmer through the trees in the distance, faint and wavering through the storm. Nathan pressed harder on the gas, his lips set, his eyes stripped of doubt. He knew that surviving this night would not erase his mistakes, but at least he would not carry the weight of regret to the end of his life. And if he failed, then this very storm would become the gravestone of a heart that once knew how to love but never learned how to keep it. And he, a man who had made countless others kneel, was now nothing more than a man running toward the woman he should never have let go. The tires screeched against the slick concrete as the black Cadillac swung sharply into the emergency entrance of Mercy General, sending a burst of white spray up the outer wall of the hospital. Nathan Calloway slammed the brakes, the car skidding sideways for several feet before coming to a hard stop. He pushed the door open and stepped out without reaching for an umbrella, walking straight into the icy rain that struck his face like needles. His coat clung to his back, his shoes were soaked through, yet he did not slow for even a single step. The glass doors slid open, and the sterile cold of the hospital rushed toward him, along with the familiar sting of disinfectant. The harsh white neon lights stripped everything bare, revealing his rain-drenched face, his bloodshot eyes, and the fierce determination burning beneath them. At the reception desk, 3 nurses looked up, startled, as if a storm had walked through the door. "I am Nathan Calloway. Emily Carter is here. I am her emergency contact," he said, his voice hoarse from cold and restraint. One of the nurses rose immediately, her hands trembling as she grabbed the file. Yes, you are the compatible donor. Please follow me," she urged breathlessly. He did not ask questions. He simply followed her down the long corridor, each step echoing sharply against the tile floor. Closed emergency rooms lined both sides, doctors rushing past with tension etched into their faces. The nurse led him to the maternity waiting area, where the lights were softer, but the air just as suffocating. Then a door swung open from inside. A short, deep-eyed doctor in a white coat stepped out, his gloved hands still streaked with blood. "You are Nathan Calloway?" he asked, his voice urgent and firm. Nathan nodded. "I am Dr. Ivan Lorne, overseeing the surgery. Miss Carter is in extremely critical condition. She is suffering severe blood loss. The baby is losing oxygen due to a placental abruption. We are trying to save both of them, but we need blood, and you are the only person in this region with AB negative, a match to hers." The final words struck like a hammer against stone. Nathan's chest constricted painfully. He said nothing, only nodded again. The doctor signaled to a nurse, who guided Nathan to the transfusion room. When the needle pierced his vein, he did not flinch. The tube slowly filled from clear to dark red, carrying the only thing that might keep Emily tethered to life. Then a young nurse walking by glanced at the label on the transfusion bag and blurted, "The father, right? Thank God you made it." Nathan froze. That sentence, though casually spoken, echoed through him like a church bell in an abandoned sanctuary. Father. A simple word, only 2 syllables, yet heavy enough to reshape a lifetime. He had never called himself that, never dared imagine it, partly out of fear, partly because he had denied the child from the moment Emily told him. But now, sitting in that cold room with his blood flowing into the woman he once cast out of his life, he understood there was no denying it anymore. That child was his flesh and blood. The only thing that might redeem a soul he had allowed to rot in darkness for nearly 2 decades. Emily's face rose in his mind again, but not the face streaked with tears. It was her placing a hand over her belly and whispering, "I will never let this child grow up not knowing who his father is." He had once dismissed that as manipulation. But tonight, stripped of every mask in the storm outside, he was nothing more than a man on the brink of losing everything that mattered. And for the first time in his life, he felt fear. Not fear of death, fear of living if she never woke again and if the child never opened his eyes to call him father. A dull ache crept up his left arm, spreading toward his shoulder, but Nathan did not react. He sat motionless on the cold metal chair, his arm strapped tight to keep the needle from shifting, his gaze fixed on the blood bag slowly filling drop by drop. The deep red color was thick and heavy, like the years of his life, burdened with guilt, mistakes, and solitude. Each drop spilled from his body not only carried life but a silent confession. Behind that door, Emily was fighting between life and death, while the child who had never seen daylight hovered on the edge of disappearing if either of them failed. Nathan did not believe in God, nor in divine justice, but in this moment, as his body cooled, his hands numbed, his head swam, and his lips dried from the loss of blood, he began to think that maybe this was the cost he was meant to pay. The cost of leaving a good woman to face a year of loneliness, the cost of refusing a love that had stood right before him. Things might have been different if he had not turned away that day, if he had reached for her instead of pushing her aside, if he had asked questions instead of believing whispers. But life does not accept if. And now, in the deadly stillness of this small room washed in white light, there was nothing left except a man offering his blood as the only redemption he had left to give. A nurse stepped in to check the transfusion, glanced at the monitors, and nodded softly, surprised to see him sitting so still and silent. "Are you all right?" she asked gently, as if speaking to someone who might break. Nathan did not answer at first, his eyes still locked on the bag. After a moment, his voice came out, rough and low. "If she lives, I will change everything." She looked at him, unsure whether he was speaking to her or confessing to the walls, then quietly slipped out. The door clicked shut, and silence reclaimed the room. Nathan leaned his head back against the wall. Above him, the fluorescent light flickered, brightening and dimming like the unsteady heartbeat of the woman he had once loved more than he ever admitted. He imagined her body lying cold on an operating table, her face pale, strength drained from her limbs, her dark hair once a comfort to him after long nights stained with blood. He imagined her hands, the same hands that once traced the scar on his back, and whispered that pain did not make him weaker, it proved he had survived. Now those hands might be cold, her pulse faltering, and all he could do was sit here, give blood, and hope. Hope that his blood could hold on to the only thing he had ever possessed, without understanding its worth. When the second bag began to fill, his body felt heavier, yet his eyes stayed wide open. He refused to close them, refused to let fatigue take him. This was not a time to rest. This was the time to atone. A signal light flashed in the hallway, footsteps pounded past, and someone shouted, "She's crashing. Prepare for emergency transfer." Nathan's heart stopped for a beat. He tried to stand, but the tube still ran from his arm and the blood was not yet enough. He clenched his jaw, enduring the prickling pain crawling through his limbs. He repeated in his mind, word by word, like a brutal prayer, "She will not die. Not because I was late. Not tonight." And through the haze of blood loss, the blurred light, and the sense of floating loose from his own body, he heard a voice inside his mind, soft and familiar, not anyone's except hers. "I am still here. But will you keep me this time?" And he answered in silence, his soul cracking open with the force of the vow. "I will not let you go, not for a single heartbeat again." The door to the transfusion room swung open just as the second bag was nearly full, and a man in a white coat stepped inside, the kind of presence that needed no introduction to make Nathan Calloway narrow his eyes. Gray threaded through his hair. His frame was tall and lean, yet his gaze was sharp as a blade, his face carrying the worn lines of someone who had stood at the edge between life and death too many times. Dr. Shaw. The name pulled with it a chain of memories Nathan had never expected to revisit in a moment like this. 20 years earlier, in a small hospital outside New Jersey, an 18-year-old boy with a knife wound deep near his lung had been rushed into the emergency room on a winter night. No one asked his name, no one called the police. There had been only a young resident who did not ask questions, who simply bent over the table stitching torn vessels back together, holding on to the last breath of someone he knew could not possibly be innocent. Nathan had lived because of those hands. In return, he had once asked what the man wanted in payment. Dr. Shaw did not want money, did not want favors. He had spoken only one sentence. "If the day ever comes when you see me again and I need you to trust me without question, do not turn your back." Tonight that sentence seemed to replay itself, clearer and more alive than ever. Shaw regarded Nathan without politeness. "The blood is already being transfused to her," he said, "but we have a bigger problem. Her heart is responding weakly to the stimulants. If it does not stabilize in the next 10 minutes, we will have to gamble everything on a more aggressive intervention, and I need you to sign consent for maximum risk." Nathan clenched his jaw. "Speak plainly, doctor." Shaw moved closer, laying a sheet of paper in front of him, its small printed lines dense and unforgiving. "If we proceed with advanced resuscitation procedures, We might be able to save the mother or the child, but there is no guarantee that we can save both. Every minute that passes narrows the options. I will try to keep them both, but you must prepare yourself." Nathan looked down at the paper. The words swam before his eyes. Her name, Emily Carter. Condition, critical. Cause, uncontrolled hemorrhage. Signature, medical proxy. An empty line waited for his name, one signature standing between life and death. He lifted his gaze to Shaw. "If you were me, who would you choose?" Shaw did not blink. "If I were myself, I would choose hope. But I am a physician. You are the man she loves. You must answer that question on your own." Silence stretched between them like an endless chasm. Two men linked by a debt that could not be settled with numbers. Then Nathan took the pen and signed his name in a stroke so hard the ink nearly tore through the paper. Shaw nodded, folded the document, and turned away. At the doorway he paused. "I have watched many people go," he said quietly, but even unconscious. Her eyes keep turning toward someone. She repeats your name like a plea. Nathan faltered. It felt as if someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart in a fist. Hovering between life and death, Emily was still calling him. Even though he was the one who had cast her out, the one who had left her to walk through all of this alone, she still called for him as if he were the last light left to cling to. Dr. Shaw stepped out, leaving Nathan alone with the realization that for the first time in his life, no power, no fists, no gun in his jacket could do anything. Only trust, memory, and a mountain of mistakes demanding payment with the life of the woman he loved. He leaned back against the wall, eyes fixed on the ceiling, and whispered as if confessing to himself, "I owed you one life once. Now I owe her an entire lifetime." In that instant, Nathan understood more clearly than ever that the greatest debt is not money and not blood. It is love squandered and thrown away. And if Emily survived, he would spend the rest of his days paying it back, not with words, with actions, day after day, second after second, every heartbeat left in him. An alarm tore through the corridor, shrill and brutal, like a blow driven straight into Nathan Calloway's chest. All other sounds in the hospital seemed to fall away as 3 urgent words rang out over the intercom. Code red, Operating Room 7, Patient Emily Carter, cardiac arrest. In a sliver of a second, the blood inside him felt as if it had turned to ice. He lurched to his feet, the tubing still dangling from his arm, blood spilling from the needle prick that had not yet been properly dressed. A nurse shouted for him to stop, but he was already out the door, moving like a storm unleashed. His heart pounded wildly, no longer from blood loss but from the most primitive fear of all, losing her. The hallway stretched before him like an endless tunnel. Every step was another beat of desperation. Every hospital doorway he had ever walked through in his life had been for pressure, for negotiation, for threat. Today he pushed his way through the doors of the operating room like a man staking his own soul. 2 nurses moved to block his way but never had the chance. Nathan shoved them aside and the door flew open. The harsh surgical lights blazed into his eyes. The machine screamed, and Dr. Shaw was shouting orders to his team. "Continue compressions. Prepare adrenaline. We have no rhythm." Emily lay motionless on the table, her skin a ghastly white, her lips blue, her eyes closed as if every last trace of light had left her. A nurse saw Nathan rushing in and instinctively moved to stop him, but Shaw lifted his head, his gaze locking with Nathan's for a fraction of a second before he gave the smallest nod. No one tried to bar him again. Nathan stood frozen as he looked at the body he knew so well lying there beneath the surgical drapes, wires trailing from her chest, the lines on the monitor collapsing toward nothing, and then, without knowing why or how, some instinct in him took over. He moved to her side, dropped to his knees, and laid his trembling hand over hers, cold as ice. He bent his head until his lips were near her ear, and spoke in a voice he had never heard come from his own throat. "Emily, if you can still hear me, please do not go. I am here now. This time I am not leaving. It is my fault. All of it is my fault. But if you come back, I swear I will never let you spend another moment in loneliness." 1 second passed, then another. Nothing changed. The doctor kept pressing on her chest. A nurse injected adrenaline into her heart. The screen remained a flat, merciless line. Nathan lifted his head, his eyes wild and haunted, then leaned closer until his forehead pressed against hers. "You once told me that even if I turn my back, you would still love me," he whispered. "Now I am asking you, just this one time, choose to stay. Choose me, choose our child." He spoke into the rhythm of the machines that no longer marked a heartbeat. And then, as if someone had tugged on the thin thread suspending her between two worlds, the monitor emitted a single beep, then another. The flat line quivered. Slowly, it began to rise. A pulse returned, a trace of rhythm. Her heart began to beat again. The room held its breath for a fraction of a moment before erupting in motion. Nurses cried out that they had a rhythm. Dr. Shaw said nothing, only barked orders to stabilize her blood pressure. Nathan released her hand and staggered back, his body gone weak, his spine pressed against the wall, his hands shaking as if with fever. He did not know what had just happened, or whether his desperate words had reached her through the dark, but she was still here. She had not gone, and that alone was enough to keep him standing. A nurse came to his side and touched his shoulder lightly, but he said nothing. His eyes never left Emily. Her face was still pale, but her chest rose and fell in faint, steady movements. She was breathing. She was alive. There was hope, and if a heart could begin beating again after it had stopped, then perhaps love too could be brought back from the depths, even after it had been buried in shadow. The steady beeping from the monitor was not enough to make Nathan Calloway breathe easier. Emily's heart had begun to beat again, but that was only the first step in a battle where everything remained fragile. She was still deeply unconscious, her blood pressure rising and falling without rhythm, and the child inside her still had no guarantee of survival. The entire emergency room felt strung so tight it might snap. Every breath waited with the fear that it might be the last. Dr. Shaw strode quickly to the head of the bed, eyes fixed on the charts, muttering rapid medical terms that sounded like the frantic notes of a storm pressed into words. Nurses rushed to adjust lines, check vitals, and stabilize equipment while Nathan stood motionless at the edge of the operating table, his hands at his sides but his gaze burning with a strange new fire. It was no longer the look of a man accustomed to commanding others, but the look of a man holding on to the last chance to save what he loved most. Dr. Shaw lifted his head and called him over, his voice low and sharp as if slicing straight through the moment. "Her condition is not stable, Nathan. She has already gone into cardiac arrest once. If she goes again, the chances of recovery are nearly zero. And the child is suffering severe oxygen deprivation. If we do not deliver within the next 5 minutes, the risk of permanent brain damage is extraordinary. But if we operate now, Emily may not survive the procedure." Nathan swallowed hard, staring straight at him. "What are the choices?" "We can delay delivery for a few minutes to stabilize the mother," the doctor said, "but that would put the baby at extreme risk. Or we can deliver now, knowing Emily's chances of surviving this surgery are less than 50%. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The numbers on the monitor flickered without meaning. The noise of the room faded, as if sinking underwater. Nathan could hear only his own heartbeat, and a single question roaring like thunder in his mind. Whom must he choose? Emily or the child, the woman he loved, or the life he had never met? His own flesh and blood, standing before him in two bodies, and he was allowed to save only one. For anyone it would have been a cruel verdict. But for Nathan Calloway, a man who had lived under the law of violence, a man who had ordered the end of other lives without a blink, it was the first time he understood the agony of a choice with no mercy. He clenched his fists until the tendons stood rigid beneath his skin. "There is no or. Save them both. I will not lose anyone." Dr. Shaw frowned. "Nathan, you need to understand." But Nathan cut him off, his eyes sharp as ice though his voice broke in places. "You said you would. Choose hope. Then fight for it now." She called my name when her heart stopped. "Doctor." She did not give up. "I am not giving up either. Do not ask me to choose between my wife and my child. I have lost too much already. This time I will not accept half a miracle." The room fell silent for a heartbeat. A nurse glanced at the doctor, then at Nathan. And then Dr. Shaw inhaled deeply, as if placing his own career on the line. He turned and spoke with firm resolve. "Prep for dual intervention. Call the advanced resuscitation team. We are going to try to save them both." The door closed behind him. Nathan stood there, his heart still pounding, but for the first time in hours there was light in his eyes. Not blind hope, but belief. Belief that if love fought hard enough, the impossible might tilt in its favor. Belief that if Emily was still fighting, he would be here, fighting alongside her to the final second. Inside the operating room, the clatter of instruments rang out like metal striking metal, the bright surgical lights glaring over everything, as if every remaining spark of life had gathered at this single point where Emily lay suspended between two worlds. The surgical teams moved quickly into position, one focusing on Emily's failing heart and transfusion lines, the other ready to deliver the baby as fast as human hands could move. Nathan stood outside the thick window of the operating room, his fingers interlocked before his chest, as if in prayer, though he had never believed in anything divine. Inside his chest there was only one repeated whisper, over and over, "Please do not take them from me." The tension reached a breaking point, and then suddenly the lights in the hallway flickered. Once, twice, then went black. The entire emergency wing dropped into suffocating darkness, pierced only by the rising wail of the hospital's emergency alarm system. A heartbeat later, the red strobes flashed, and a nurse burst out of the operating room, her face chalk white. "The main power system has failed. The backup generator is not engaging. All equipment inside the operating room is down. The heart monitors, the ventilator, the surgical tools, everything had fallen silent." Inside, Emily's abdomen was already open, the child only minutes from delivery. Yet now there was no power, no machines, nothing to keep them alive. Nathan froze as the world dropped out beneath him. Even with all his influence and money, he could not stop this. But the paralysis lasted only a single breath. He tore his phone from his pocket, his hand shaking as he dialed. "Dominic, bring my team. All of them. Mercy General. Now. Bring mobile generators. You have 5 minutes, not 6. If you cannot do that, do not call me your boss again. No explanations, no bargains." On the other end, Dominic answered with one sharp word and hung up. Minutes later, the roar of motorcycle engines rolled like thunder at the hospital gate. Figures in black surged forward out of the night. Dominic, the closest man Nathan had ever trusted, led a team of 5, all former combat logistics specialists, hauling 2 high-power generators once used in rescue operations along the Colombian border. Without waiting for permission, they broke into the basement engineering room, rewired circuits with the precision of seasoned technicians, and sent another operative sprinting up the stairwell with a dedicated medical-grade battery pack for the surgery suite. Within 3 minutes, the lights surged back on, brilliant and steady, as if nothing had ever failed. The entire hospital stared in disbelief, but the doctors wasted no time asking questions. They continued operating, saving every second they had left. Nathan stood in the hallway, breath ragged, sweat soaking his back as if he had run through fire. He did not sit, he did not rest. He watched through the glass as the team moved around Emily like a whirlwind. Emily and the child. Dominic approached quietly, placed a steady hand on Nathan's shoulder, gave a single firm squeeze, and stepped away, his task done. Everyone in that corridor understood that tonight had nothing to do with power, nothing to do with reputation. Tonight was the night a man wagered everything to hold on to the last thing in this world he still had the strength to love. And in the darkness, when the most advanced systems failed, it had been determination, loyalty, and something dangerously close to love that brought the lights back. Machines can stop. Hope does not. Life may be fragile, but as long as someone is willing to run into the storm for it, there is still a chance. And Nathan Calloway, once feared as a kingpin, had become something else entirely. He was a father fighting for his child, a man fighting for the woman he loved, and a soul learning how to rescue not only their lives but the part of himself he had let die many years ago. The cry that split the bright operating room rose like a streak of lightning straight through Nathan Calloway's chest, shattering every layer of ice, every fear, every restraint he had carried all his life. It was not the crack of gunfire, not the scream of someone begging for their life, not any sound that belonged to the world of blood and power he ruled. It was the most primal sound, the purest, most sacred sound a man who had once lost everything could ever hear. It was the sound of his son's first cry, released on the razor-thin line between life and death. In that instant, the whole world seemed to stop. Nathan stood frozen outside the operating room, his eyes unblinking behind the thick glass. His heart pounded wildly, no longer bound by logic or habit, only by the raw instinct of a man who was, for the first time, being called a father. Inside, the obstetrician lifted the baby, a tiny body, purple tinged and slick with blood. Yet his cry rang out with fierce insistence, a declaration to the universe that he had arrived, that he had survived, that he existed as proof that love never truly disappears. A nurse wrapped the child in a white blanket, tucking him in snugly, wiping away the blood, then quickly checked his heartbeat, his lungs, his reflexes. Everything moved like a storm in fast motion, but Nathan stayed rooted to the spot, as if nailed to the floor. He could not tear his gaze away from that small form, could not look away even as every muscle in his body trembled with exhaustion and emotion pressed down to the breaking point. And then something happened that he had never dared imagine. A nurse stepped out, came up to him, her face still drawn tight with strain but her eyes brightened by a glimmer of hope. She did not say much. She simply nodded and gently placed the baby in his arms. Nathan reached out, and the very moment his arms closed around that tiny life, his body trembled as if struck by a bolt of current. The child weighed less than 3 kilos, his little frame fitting entirely within the arms that had once drawn guns, tightened, around throats, and guarded an empire in the shadows. But now, those same arms cradled the most fragile, most untouched thing he had ever held, his son. The baby's eyes were not fully open yet, his mouth pressed into a small pout, as if offended at being pulled out of the warm shelter he had known. Nathan bent his head, brushed his lips gently against his son's forehead, his breath breaking apart like a whispered confession. He said nothing, but in the wet shimmer of his eyes lay every apology, every promise, every moment he should have been there and was not. He was the man who had walked through death and danger, the man whose hands did not shake at any life or death decision. Yet in that moment he felt weaker than he had ever been. Not because he feared losing something, but because for the first time in his life he had something he wanted to protect at any cost. A doctor passing by laid a hand on his shoulder, murmuring that Emily had not woken yet, but her responses were stabilizing. The surgery was ongoing. They could not promise anything, but she was alive, and that was a beginning. Nathan nodded, though his eyes never left the child. His broad hand trembled as he touched his son's tiny fingers. The baby curled his hand around one of Nathan's fingers by instinct, holding on with a surprising strength, as if anchoring him to the world. In that instant, Nathan knew that whether Emily woke or not, whether tomorrow was kind or cruel, his life would never be the same. A new chapter had opened, and on the first page there was no blood, no power, no shadow, only the echo of a cry, soft skin, a fragile breath, and a single word swelling inside his chest. Father. He bent down again, pressing his cheek to his son's, and whispered from the deepest chamber of his soul, "Welcome, little warrior. You are here now. And your father is ready to learn how to love from the very beginning." The recovery room was so quiet that the ticking of the clock on the wall could be heard clearly, each click marking another second in the countdown to something sacred about to unfold. Outside, the sky was still heavy. The rain had not stopped completely but had softened, falling in scattered drops that tapped gently against the fogged window pane. In the soft wash of warm yellow light, Nathan sat in silence by the bed, his hand wrapped around Emily's, like the last strand keeping him upright after everything that had happened. The baby had been taken to the nursery, and now this room held only 2 people, one who had just crossed the threshold of life and death, and one who was learning how to become human again. She had not woken in the 4 hours since the surgery, but the steady beat of her heart and the gentle rise and fall of her breath offered a hope that had never felt so tangible. Nathan's gaze never left her face, the face he had conjured in dreams thick with regret, the face he had run from during those foolish months when he told himself that leaving her was the only way to keep her safe. Now, staring at the faint flutter of her lashes, at the pale skin still marked by the redness left from tubes and tape at her neck and wrists, he saw a woman who had fought like a warrior, not only for herself, but for the small life lying in a crib down the hall, and for the man who had wounded her more deeply than any injury to flesh. A tiny movement in her fingers made him jump. Then her lashes quivered again, slow and fragile like a butterfly's first attempt to move its wings after a long sleep. Her eyes opened gradually, clouded and unfocused at first, then slowly clearing. She looked up at the ceiling, then turned her gaze to the side, and her eyes met his. Nathan's grip on her hand softened, a shaky smile pulling at his mouth. "Hello," he whispered, his voice hoarse like someone who had nearly lost it. Emily stared at him for several long seconds without blinking. Then a flicker of recognition crossed her face, her eyes narrowing. Slightly, Not with confusion, but with clarity sharpened by memory. She remembered. All of it. She tried to speak, but no sound came, only a faint rush of air between parted lips. Nathan leaned in, worried. "Take it slow. Do not try to talk yet. You are safe now, and so is the baby." She turned her face away, closing her eyes as if that simple movement could erase his presence. It was a deliberate turning, not a weak one. Nathan felt as though someone had slammed a door in his face without raising their voice, without hurling a single accusation, using only a look that held no trust. Emily faced him again after a moment. This time in her eyes he saw everything he had feared most. Not rage, but the quiet finality of someone who no longer wanted to hope. Someone who no longer wished for anything from the person in front of them. It was the gaze of a woman who had once loved, once forgiven, once waited, but had walked beyond the edge of what her heart could endure. Nathan started to speak, but stopped himself. Because he understood. There were no words he could string together that would erase the months she had spent alone, the nights she had carried his child without him, the mornings she had awakened with no idea whether to hate him or still love him. So he stayed where he was, neither begging nor defending himself. He simply looked at her with eyes that, for the first time in his life, hid nothing. "I came," he said at last, each word slow and measured, "and I know that is not enough. But I am not leaving again. Even if you never believe me, even if you never love me again, I will be here, for you, for our child." She closed her eyes once more, and a few tears slipped silently from the corners, soaking into the pillow. They were not the tears of someone overwhelmed by tenderness or broken by weakness. They were the tears that fall when there is nothing left to cry, the last fragments of a wounded heart slipping loose. Nathan did not wipe them away. He knew she needed to cry, to be angry, to be silent, and he would wait, as long as it took, because today she had opened her eyes. And that was the first miracle he had ever witnessed in a life that had known far too much darkness. The room remained steeped in silence after Emily closed her eyes, and the quiet tears slid down the white pillow, and Nathan Calloway stayed exactly where he was, unmoving, his gaze resting on her with a pain he had never known. He had once faced underground trials, stared into the eyes of traitors as he handed down their fate, listened to pleading voices collapse into despair, yet nothing had ever pierced him the way it did now, as he watched this woman turn her face away, as though his very existence no longer held meaning. She did not scream why, did not hurl accusations or bitterness, but her eyes had already shown him the lonely fractures he had left her to carry alone. Emily did not cry out the question, but Nathan repeated it inside his own mind until it haunted every breath he took. Why had he walked away at the moment she needed him most? Why had he chosen not to believe her? Why had he left the woman who loved him with her whole heart to weather fear and cold and the growing weight of a child she had carried without knowing whether the man who fathered that life would ever return? He watched her for a long time, until the hand holding hers tightened again, as if he feared the smallest loosened grip might allow her to disappear. When he finally spoke, his voice came low and rough, breaking apart like dust shaken loose from long-forgotten words. "Emily, I am not asking you to forgive me. I am only asking you to listen to me once." She did not open her eyes, but he knew she could hear him. Even if her heart wanted to lock itself away from everything, she was still here, still breathing, and he still had a chance, however faint. "I once believed leaving you was the best way to protect you. I carried too many enemies, too much darkness. I was afraid that if I kept you by my side, one day you would be swallowed by the same cold and brutal world that shaped me. But I was wrong. I was wrong not to ask if you were willing to face it with me. I was wrong to let you fight alone in a battle where I should have stood in front, and I was wrong not to realize that losing you was the most terrifying thing in my entire life." Emily stirred slightly, her lashes trembling, her face still calm but something deeper shifting beneath the lids that hid her eyes. Nathan continued, his voice tightening as though something lodged in his throat. "When I heard your voice at 2 o'clock in the morning, I did not think of anything except getting to you. Not out of duty, not because of a title, but because my heart knew that if you vanished, I would not be able to go on, not for one more day, not for one more hour, not even for one more minute. And when I saw you lying there, cold, weak, barely alive, I knew if you did not survive, then the rest of my years would mean nothing." She opened her eyes, slowly, tiredly, but they lifted to him like a question that needed no words. Nathan held his breath, watching her as though she were the only answer he had ever sought and never dared write down. Then he bowed his head like a man surrendering his last defenses. "I never stopped loving you, Emily. Even when I tried to bury it, tried to drown it with silence, with distance, with meetings held around murderers, with sleepless nights and cold whiskey, it was still there, right here." He pressed his hand over his heart, where it beat unevenly like a frightened child waking from a nightmare. That love never left. It was only buried beneath fear and selfishness. "But I am done running. You do not have to forgive me. You can hate me for the rest of your life. But I will still be here, every day, little by little, until you see that I did not come back to atone. I came back because I love you, truly." Emily did not speak, but her tears fell, quietly. Tears that had formed long before, only now finally finding the strength to leave her eyes. She turned to him again, and the look she gave him was no longer sharp with ice. It was tired, but something in the wall she had built around her heart had begun to crack, and for Nathan, that single look was enough to keep him going. Not as a kingpin who once held the city in his hands, but as a man willing to risk everything just to hear her say, even once more in this lifetime, that she had loved him too. The first light of morning slipped through the frosted glass of the recovery room, gentle as a whisper of life returning. And outside the window, the sky after the night's storm seemed washed clean, blue and strangely still. The room no longer held the frantic chorus of machines from hours before, only the steady beat of a heart monitor and the slow breathing of the woman who had just come back from the edge. Emily rested her head against the pillow, her body still fragile after surgery, but her eyes were clearer now, no longer lost. Beside her, Nathan sat at the edge of the bed, his hand wrapped around hers, saying little, only glancing at her from time to time, sometimes tightening his grip as if to remind her he was still there. Then the door opened gently, and a young nurse stepped inside, carrying a small bundle wrapped in a white blanket, her eyes brightening when she saw Emily awake before she turned to Nathan as if waiting for permission. Nathan rose and nodded. The nurse moved closer, bending slightly as though she feared disturbing the fragile air around them. "Hello there," she whispered softly. "Mom can finally meet her son." Emily tilted her head, her gaze landing on the tiny life cradled in the nurse's arms, and something broke open inside her. She tried to lift her hand but lacked the strength, so Nathan leaned in, guiding her arm up, and with the nurse's help he placed the baby into her embrace. It was the first time Emily had seen her child, his small face, his eyes still closed, his tiny hand twitching with instinct as though searching for the warmth of the woman who had carried him through months of fear and uncertainty. A sound caught in her throat, not quite a sob, and tears slid down her cheek steers, not of pain, but of everything she had survived and everything she thought she had lost. Nathan froze, then slowly sat beside her, his arm slipping gently behind her, holding both mother and child in a careful embrace, as though even the slightest wrong movement might shatter the moment like glass. In that small, quiet space, the past fell silent. There were no questions, no doubts, only three people: a man who had once lost himself, a woman who had just been reborn, and a small miracle sleeping between them. Emily pressed a soft kiss to her son's forehead, whispering something only he could hear. And Nathan did not ask what she said. He simply watched them as if the universe had condensed into that single scene. A doctor stepped in for a quick check, smiling when he saw how quickly Emily was improving. "We have never seen a recovery quite like this," he said, glancing at Nathan with a measured look. "Perhaps it is the will to fight, or the person beside her." Nathan said nothing, only nodded, his eyes fixed on his son. For the first time in his life, he felt small, not the man who once made others tremble, not the name whispered in shadowed rooms, but a man learning how to be a father, learning how to love without fear. Emily looked at her baby, then at Nathan, her voice still weak but steady and deep like a spring returning to flow. "He needs a name." Nathan nodded. He had hoped for this moment, though he never dared to speak first. He knew that even if this child bore his blood, the right to name him could not come from a man who had walked away, a man relearning love from the ground up. But Emily did not turn away. Her forgiveness was not complete, but her gaze no longer held walls. She opened a door by asking him, "What name do you think suits him?" It was a small question, but to Nathan it was a doorway he had not dared to reach for until she offered it. He looked at the child and whispered, almost asking himself, "Jonathan." Emily furrowed her brow gently, tilting her head, her eyes waiting for something deeper. Nathan exhaled slowly and continued, his voice dropping. "When I was a boy, someone who took care of me in the orphanage gave me that name. He was the first person who taught me how to write it. But he was also the first person killed for hiding me. That name was all he left me before I ran from that place and stepped into a life with no way back. I never used it again. Until today. I think it is time for it to carry a new meaning, not the beginning of darkness, but the beginning of light." Emily looked at their son and smiled softly. "Jonathan," she repeated, tasting the name with all the love she had left. "And his middle name?" Nathan hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Carter. It is your name. I want it to be a part of him, something no one could ever take away." Her eyes flickered, then she nodded. "And his last name?" Nathan bowed his head, not answering right away. "If you do not want him to carry the name Calloway, I will understand." But Emily shook her head, her voice gentler. "He is ours, and if I had the strength to carry him this far, then I am strong enough not to fear your past repeating itself." She looked at the baby and whispered, as though christening something sacred, "Jonathan Carter Calloway." In that moment the name did not sound like mere words, but like a vow not only among the three of them, but between past and future, between mistakes and hope. The baby stirred lightly in his mother's arms, his tiny hand curling around her finger, as if to say he had heard his own name. Nathan bent down, kissed his son's forehead, then looked at Emily with gratitude, not because she had forgiven him, but because she had given their child a chance to live with a name carrying not a burden, but hope. Jonathan Carter Calloway, born in a night of storm and shadow, now called into being by the first morning light they had ever shared together. The afternoon settled gently through the hospital room's window, the soft golden sunlight draping everything in a warm, quiet glow, and the air itself seemed to pause, free from hurried footsteps or the heavy rhythm of machines, leaving only the steady breathing of a newborn sleeping in his mother's arms and the unwavering gaze of the man who had once lost them both. Emily leaned back against the pillows, her eyes tired but peaceful, her fingers brushing lightly through her baby's hair as she glanced at Nathan now and then, as if to reassure herself he was truly still there and would not vanish the way he once had. And Nathan, sitting at the edge of the bed, kept his hands clasped tightly together on his knees, not to command, not to intimidate, but to hold in place something fragile and overwhelming stirring deep inside his chest. For years no one had taught him when a man was supposed to cry. No one had told him what real loss felt like. Not until he nearly lost Emily, nearly lost his son before even knowing his face. He watched mother and child for a long time, and then without prompting, without seeking permission he spoke, driven by a truth he could no longer keep buried. "I used to believe there were things I could control with power, with money, with guns and fear. But when I saw you lying there, your heart stopped, and no one could promise me you would live. I realized none of it could save anything. It could not save you. It could not save him. And it could not save me." Emily did not answer right away. She simply listened, the same way she had once listened to his half-spoken thoughts, the things he always hid beneath the hardened armor of a man feared by so many. But now his voice carried no armor, no strategy, no cold certainty, only the tremor of a man learning for the first time what it meant to be afraid. "I cannot live another day if it means going back to the man I was. I cannot return to blood, to shadowed deals, to nights no one knew where I was, to leaving you waiting in fear that I might never come home. Jonathan deserves a father he does not have to hide, a father he will never be ashamed to speak of, and you deserve a man who does not bring dread into every breath you take." He rose, stepped closer, and lowered himself to one knee beside her and the child, his eyes lifting toward hers, not with the look of a man who once made enemies tremble, but with the quiet desperation of someone laying his entire soul bare. "I swear, here and now, before you and our son, I will never walk back into that darkness. No more deals, no more steps into the old world. If I must let go of everything just to stand in the life of my child, I will." Emily looked at him, and for the first time in so long her eyes filled with tears not born of heartbreak, but of a fractured heart trembling at the chance to heal. She did not ask whether he could keep that promise. She only placed her hand on the baby's head, then gently on Nathan's shoulder, a touch as soft and startling as a heartbeat returning. "Do not promise for me," she whispered. Promise for yourself, for him. The dark cannot follow you forever if you truly want to step out of it. Nathan nodded, pressing his hand against his own chest, where his heart pounded wildly beneath the fabric. I promise. No witnesses were needed, no ceremony required. In that sunlit room filled with the breath of a newborn child, the promise seemed to carve itself into the air, into the walls, into the deepest parts of the two people who had once broken each other. It was not an ending. It was the beginning of a man choosing the light after a lifetime in shadow, not to escape, but to become worthy of love, of life, and of the name Jonathan Carter Calloway. 3 weeks later, in a small home on the northern outskirts of Oregon, there were no more ringing phones, no more midnight calls heavy with orders, no more strangers in black suits waiting at the gate each late afternoon. There was only the soft laughter of a baby drifting to sleep in his mother's arms and the steady footsteps of a man who had once made the underworld bow, now moving carefully across a sunlit living room while holding his son. Nathan Calloway was no longer a name whispered in FBI briefings or hidden ledgers. Everything that belonged to the darkness he had left behind, just as he had promised Emily and their child. The scars on his hands remained, but they were no longer symbols of power or survival. They were reminders that some battles were meant to end in love. That morning, as he changed a diaper without help, clumsily mixed formula with surprising patience, and kissed Emily's forehead before she drifted back to sleep, he understood that he was living an entirely different life, and peaceful, because danger had vanished, but precious because it was finally worth protecting. He had nothing left to prove, no one left to intimidate, only a son growing a little more each day, and a woman who had forgiven the unforgivable. And if anyone were to ask who Nathan Calloway was now, he would not say he was once the man who ran the largest criminal empire on the West Coast. He would simply say he was Jonathan's father, a man learning how to love from the beginning. This story is not only about a kingpin laying down his power. It is a reminder that in every person, no matter how far lost, there is always a path home if they have the courage to face their mistakes with real love. A child can save a soul, a single tear can soften a heart forged in steel, and one promise can change a life if spoken at the right time to the right person. Dear listener, how do you feel after hearing this story? Did something inside you still? Did some part of Nathan and Emily's journey echo in your own life or in the heart of someone you love? We would be grateful to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below and share your reflections with us. If this story touched you, do not forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who might need a story that reaches gently and deeply. Each day we will bring you another journey, another moving tale, another reminder that hope is always near and that there is always a chance to begin again, no matter how dark yesterday may have been. Thank you for staying with us until the end. We wish you health, peace, and a life cherished in every moment. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next story.